I'm Jim English, professor in the English department and director of the forum, the Humanities Forum. I want to thank you all for coming today. And I'll also thank the departments of the History of Art and the History and Sociology of Science who are co-sponsoring this talk, as well as the staff of the University Museum, as always, for sharing their space. Let me remind you, as usual, to silence your phones, if you will, at this point. Also, as usual, we'll take a 5-minute break before our question and answer period, so that those of you who need to depart or stretch your legs at that stage can do so without disruption. This is the 5th in our series of lectures and events on the topic of virtuality. Looking ahead, on Wednesday, December 8th, in this same auditorium, we will be presenting a talk by Todd Knockover, professor of music at MIT, and a composer of innovative operas, most recently Death and the Powers, which premiered a month or two ago in Monaco and features, among other things, a robot chorus. Knockover is the inventor of so-called hyper-instruments. What else? He's the brains behind Guitar Hero, the video game. And he's a pioneer in the use of musical instruments for medical purposes. He's going to be demonstrating as well as talking about his work and in new music technologies. I think it's going to be a really fun and interesting event. So that's something to put on your calendars for after Thanksgiving, December 8th at 5 p.m. Today, we're going to approach virtuality a little differently. Professor Claudia Swan will discuss our topic not in connection with emergent digital technologies, but in terms of that original technology of the virtual, the human imagination. However, lest you should imagine that Professor Swan is some kind of throwback or technophobe, I'm going to divulge to you a bit of gossip about the use that she has made of her computer. She was the first person I knew of who actually met her spouse through internet matchmaking technology and virtual dating. Yes, it worked for her. This is a decade ago, well before the explosion of social networking and all that. And they're still married. And in fact, if I'm right, her husband is a kind of a techie guy who works in like new media. So, Professor Swan will be speaking today about the Renaissance. She is well plugged into the contemporary scene and has some techie bona fides. Not, of course, that such things really matter. The virtual and the problem of its relationship to the real did not suddenly arise with the invention of computers. Virtuality, the almost real, the not quite real, the as good as real, this has been a major preoccupation of philosophers and ordinary people since ancient times. Professor Swan's work has explored the boundaries between the real thing and its imitation, between genuine and fake science, between legitimate and illegitimate forms of knowledge production, between sound evidence and bogus conjecture, between truth and falsehood. And she has focused on the role of artists in limiting these boundaries and making them all the more permeable and unstable. Her field of specialization is early modern Europe, and especially Holland, where she is currently a fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study. Since taking her PhD from Columbia, she's been on the faculty at Northwestern University. She's chaired the department, as well as founding and directing there the program in the study of imagination. She's been a fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin and at the Institute for Advanced Study in some backwater in central New Jersey. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. I've been a Penn professor married to a Princeton professor too long not to get caught up in the rivalry. Yes, at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton as well. Professor Swan is the author of a major study of the artist Jacques Degaine II, Art, Science, and Witchcraft in Early Modern Holland, and of an absolutely gorgeous book on 16th century botanical watercolors from the Clutius collection. She's also edited a volume called Colonial Botany, Science, Commerce, Politics. All of her work is interdisciplinary in the very best sense, meeting the term set for rigorous inquiry in each individual discipline, while testing their limits and pressing them into new conversations with one another. Her talk today is called Counterfeit, Chimeras, Early Modern Theories of the Imagination and the Work of Art. Please join me in welcoming, all the way from Holland, Professor Claudia Swan.
Thank you so much. It's a very good thing Professor English is such a tall man, or I would tell you some gossip, but I am intimidated. And in fact, I don't really have any. It's true that I did meet my husband online, and I'm tempted to tell you that it was because I posted all of my scholarly work that it worked out, but that is in fact not the case. I am somewhat technologically inclined, but I'm also totally intimidated by the variety of technological modes through which I am being projected and recorded. So can I just take a moment to ask if everything's okay? Everything's okay. Sound is okay? Okay. Good. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. It is a pleasure to be here among old friends, new friends, I hope. And I want to say a special word of thanks to Wendy Steiner, who issued this invitation, to Jim English, who followed through so courteously, to Sarah Varney, who has been terrific in the arrangements, and to all of those various individuals I'm thrilled to see again. So without further ado, this talk is divided into 5 parts, and the first part is called Many Strange Forms of Monstrosities and Demons. That is a quotation. Many strange forms of monstrosities and demons. The German painter and printmaker Martin Schongauer's vivid engraving, The Temptation of St. Anthony, dated to the last quarter of the 15th century, famously features a pack of 9 hideous demons whose bodies are conjugated of various bestial parts. The fantastic creatures who beset the serene saint, tugging, pulling, scratching, and beating him, comprise an array of naturalistic animal parts: tentacles, spines, wings, fur, horns, hooves, and scales have been recombined to form a concentric team of monstrous apparitions. Schongauer's rendering of the ascetic saint under siege has recently been called, and I quote, a milestone in the representation of demonic corporeality. Since its creation, it has also been recognized as an artistic feat worthy of emulation. Schongauer's ability to render the hybrid and unstable elements or qualities of these demons by reconfiguring identifiable features, that is, to create naturalistic phantasms, occasioned the print's early renown and wide impact. In the later 15th century and the early decades of the 16th, it spawned a number of copies and variations from prints by Netherlandish and German artists alike. Here is an exact but copy in reverse by Israel van Meckenem, the Netherlandish printmaker, also late 15th century, so relatively close on the heels of the original print by Schongauer. And only slightly later, a woodcut by Lukas Cranach, the German artist, dates to 1506. It's a slightly more convoluted version of the Torment of St. Anthony, who, I should point out, is here, it's not entirely as clear as it was in the Schongauer perhaps, but is held aloft by this pack of hybrid demons. Now, St. Anthony, for a very long time, I actually believed that St. Anthony had been propelled up above, let's say, sort of captured and was being beaten by these demons. But in fact, he had the rather extraordinary ability to levitate. So he's in the air of his own accord, and the demons are besieging him in that position. So the fact that he was able to levitate may account for the serenity of St. Anthony, although I have more of an explanation for that to come. And then a painted sort of riff, you might say, on the Schongauer. This is one of the many panels of the extraordinary altarpiece painted by Matthias Grunewald in the first decade of the 16th century, which was painted for the Hospital of St. Anthony at Colmar, which is Martin Schongauer's birth town. So the connection is very close. And here the pack of demons, Here, actually, Anthony seems to have lost his ability to levitate, and the demons are somewhat different and, of course, rendered in oil paint. This is not a demon, but a sufferer of the terrible torment that was a condition that was cared for at the hospital there. Like other prints by Schongauer, the Temptation of St. Anthony gained renown in Italy, too. It even, it is said, inspired Michelangelo Buonarroti's first painting. Michelangelo's recreation of Schongauer's nightmarish evocation, and I'm not saying that this is his first painting, but it probably looked a lot like this. Some people believe that this, which is a panel that hangs down in the Kimball Art Museum, is indeed Michelangelo's first painting. In any event, we do know that Michelangelo's first painting was a copy of Schongauer's Temptation of St. Anthony. Michelangelo's recreation of Schongauer's nightmarish evocation is described in contemporary biographies by both Giorgio Vasari and Ascanio Condivi, both writing in the 1550s. Vasari's Life of Michelangelo recounts that the talents of the young artist, quote, began to be made clearly manifest in the copy he executed of a printed sheet by the German Martino, which gave him a very great name. For there had come to Florence at that time a scene by the above-named Martino of the devils beating St. Anthony, engraved on copper, and Michelangelo copied it with the pen in such a manner that it could not be detected. And then he painted the same sheet in colors, going at times, this is still Vasari, in order to counterfeit, per contraffare, certain strange forms of devils, to buy fishes that had scales bizarre in coloring. So let me just read that again. So he copied it first in pen, in a manner that could not be detected, and then Michelangelo painted the same sheet in colors, going at times in order to counterfeit certain strange forms of devils, to buy fishes that had scales bizarre in coloring. And in that work, he showed so much ability that he acquired thereby credit and fame. Now, fish were not useful in the preparation of oil pigments. So why did Michelangelo go to the fish market? It's the alternative title of this talk. Like Vasari, Condivi too emphasizes the artist's recourse to the natural elements from which Schongauer's hybrid demons are constructed, noting that, this is Condivi, quote, he would go off to the fish market, where he observed the shape and the coloring of the fins of the fish, the color of the eyes and every other part, and he would render them in his painting, so that by bringing it to that perfection of which he was capable, from that time he excited the admiration of the world, close quote. Translation of printed, as in Schongauer's print, to painted, as in Michelangelo's painting, translation of printed to painted forms necessarily required articulation in color, and for that, the observation of actual specimens was surely useful. That the naturalism of these hybrid, fictive creatures was so crucial is as significant, in my view, as Vasari's use of the verb contraffare to describe the process by which Michelangelo imitated or copied Schongauer's creations. So Vasari writes that Michelangelo went to the fish market per contraffare alcune strane forme di diavoli, to counterfeit these strange forms of the devils. In other words, why, if you're making a copy, do you need to return to the original? Whether or not the small panel painted in tempera and oil shown here, recently acquired by the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, is indeed Michelangelo's first painting, it illustrates the rendering in a faithful copy of Schongauer's evocation of demonic phantasms, and thus embodies the sort of imitative exercise for which Michelangelo acquired credit and fame as a very young man. Michelangelo's early imitative exercise is at least as novel as it is complex. Both Vasari and Condivi assert that the young artist gained sudden prominence on account of imitating nature and or other works of art so closely that the copies surpassed their sources. Both biographies subsequently describe other copies, all indiscernible as replicas. Moreover, imitation and naturalism are allied with the production of demonic imagery, in this case, and notably, in the case of the saints' tormentors, of demonic conjurings of the imagination. Michelangelo's rendering of the demons transformed scales bizarre in coloring from slippery object into subject matter of another artist's conjuring. They were conjured from experience, as in turn had been Schongauer's, and transformed into wondrous products by a process of recombination. In this sense, the hybrid demons animating Schongauer's engraving are so many figures of the imagination, and more specifically of combinatory fantasia or combinatory imagination. In ways to which I will return, Michelangelo's recreation of them comprises a belated and entirely original re-invocation of the imaginative process by way of an exercise of naturalism. Now, imaginary creatures consisting of naturalistic parts, or real chimeras, figure broadly in early modern art, literature, and practice, and in a range of literary, philosophical, and even medical contexts of the era. Cennino Cennini, who wrote in circa 1400 that painting requires fantasia e operazione di mano, so fantasy or imagination and the, let's say, manual ability, also deemed the painter capable of discovering, quote, unseen things hiding under the shadow of nature and fixing them with the hand, demonstrating what does not actually exist, close quote. He invoked the power to create real fictions, real chimeras, where he argued that the artist is able to produce precisely the sort of chimera Horace had prescribed. In his Ars Poetica, the Roman poet Horace famously decries fictional hybrid creatures, whereas Cennini asserted that, quote, the painter is given freedom to compose a figure standing, sitting, half man, half horse, as it pleases him, following his fantasia, close quote. Insofar as they test the limits of credibility, real chimeras occupy a fertile, troubled intersection between perception and judgment. So I started by saying that this is a very common trope of artistic production in this era, let's say late 15th and into the early 16th century, well into the 16th century actually. And then I've shown you this very obscure actually, but one of about 10,000 ornamental prints that was produced at the time that does feature these hybrid creatures. So in this case, forms that issue from ornamental foliage into animal and fish forms. And I'll show you just another example. This is actually another Temptation of St. Anthony that was produced in the 1550s in Antwerp. And where the creatures who are here besetting the saint is sort of huddled down below here, are indeed, once again, hybrid creatures of a different sort, not the demonic sort, but hybrid creatures. So what, for early modern artists, was at stake in generating an image, a semblance of an imaginary entity, a convincing fiction, or real chimera? In a broad sense, I am invoking one of the most imposing tropes of early modern representation and the discourses surrounding it, namely the deceptiveness of images, which make the absent present seem real and are not. And of course, I'm doing that for the purposes of a forum on virtuality. So the prism through which I want to consider such illusions and their powers tonight is the early modern conception, and this is something of a surprise, even to myself sometimes, but is the early modern conception of counterfeit. So on the one hand, virtual, deceptive, non-real illusion, and on the other hand, counterfeit. Current use of the term counterfeit to signal a work whose purpose is to deceive, a fake, does not capture its early modern connotations, where to counterfeit meant to portray. In fact, numerous portraits are actually recorded in inventories and elsewhere as counterfeits. It's a term that is used to describe them. And usually to do so, that is to portray, in ways considered trustworthy, as in a portrait, for example. Although the term encompasses both significations, so fake and trustworthy, I propose that it was used in the early modern period to denote verisimilitude without connoting truthfulness. Where Vasari, in the life of Michelangelo, invokes the term, he raises a key question concerning the epistemological threat posed by what were also masterful fictions. Artistic interest in producing natural-seeming imaginary entities is key, because it engages the possibility that something unreal or imaginary could be naturalistic in appearance and truthful in effect. And here a portrait of nobody less than the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II by Arcimboldo from the first decade of the 17th century in the guise of Vertumnus, but of course a composite portrait. So here again, an entity formed of other elements. I don't know that it's entirely appropriate to call it a chimera, but I thought it was a good image. Visual paradoxes were often highly intentional and sought after, even where or precisely because they challenged the limits of knowledge and experience. Part 2, Real Chimeras. And this is a drawing by Leonardo in the Royal Collection in the UK of a chimera. The anecdote of the young, the drawing which doesn't actually resolve in a larger size and a detail, which does. The anecdote of the young Michelangelo translating Schongauer's real chimeras into his own wondrous work by way of studiously recording natural forms illustrates one way to make a false image, even as it represents a broader set of practices and concerns. It records a process cultivated and documented by Leonardo da Vinci as well. In a vivid passage of his notebooks, Leonardo offers a paradoxical recipe for making a real chimera. If, he writes, you wish to make one of your imaginary animals appear natural, let us suppose it to be a dragon, take for its head that of a mastiff or setter, for its eyes those of a cat, for its ears those of a porcupine, for its nose that of a greyhound, with the eyebrows of a lion, the temples of an old cock, and the neck of a water tortoise. Close quote. A pen and ink drawing of a fierce composite animal by Leonardo offers evidence that he followed his own recipe, producing a credible preternatural beast by recombining features of a variety of animals. In this instance, the nose of a dog, the horns of a steer, the teeth and beard of a lion, the claws of a bird of prey. That's just my guess. 2 further works by Leonardo were produced in a similar way, though I am unable to show either. The first, and this is again according to biographical documents, is a very early painting he devised on a misshapen piece of fig wood. It was indeed his first painting, in the form of a small shield, which his father passed along to him. The painting does not survive, but Vasari's account of its production in his Life of the Artist is rather gripping. Leonardo prepared the support, the piece of fig wood, and then set to thinking about, quote, what he could paint upon it that might be able to terrify all who should come upon it, producing the same effect as once did the head of Medusa, close quote. So this is his inclination. So Michelangelo's inclination when it comes to painting his first painting is to copy the Schongauer and then reproduce it. And Leonardo's evidently was to produce a painting that would have the effect of the Medusa. The following 2 slides are, the first is okay, but the second one is not for the squeamish. So this is Caravaggio's fantastic painting of the shield of Perseus, the head of Medusa. And I'll quote now from Vasari the rest of this account. For this purpose, then, Leonardo carried to a room of his own into which no one entered save himself alone, lizards, great and small, crickets, serpents, butterflies, grasshoppers, bats, and other strange kinds of such-like animals. Some of these animals he dissected, out of the number of which, variously put together, he formed a great, ugly creature, most horrible and terrifying, which emitted a poisonous breath and turned the air to flame. And he made it coming out of a dark and jagged rock, belching forth venom from its open throat, eyes, and smoke from its nostrils in so strange a fashion that it appeared altogether a monstrous, horrible thing. And long did he labor over making it, that the stench of the dead animals in that room was past bearing. But Leonardo did not notice it, so great was the love that he bore towards art. Close quote. By combining different naturalistic elements, Leonardo composed a monstrous and horrible thing. And now I will show you one that is actually quite monstrous and extraordinary. This is a co-production of Peter Paul Rubens and Franz Schneider's Antwerp, early 17th century. Again, the head of Medusa, although not a shield. Vasari's description elides the production of an actual chimera with a painted one. In fact, when he never uses the verb to paint when he describes what Leonardo does. He says that Leonardo produced this horrible, monstrous thing. Later in the life, Vasari offers an account of Leonardo's production, and this is the second work that I'm unable to show you, of a real chimera in 3 dimensions. And now I'm going to, unless you would like me to keep this on, I can go to a blank slide. How about that? Because this you should imagine. Vasari writes that in Rome, at a time when he was greatly concerned with philosophy and intensely involved in alchemy, Leonardo, quote, shaped animals very thin and full of wind, and by blowing into them, made them fly through the air. On the back of a most bizarre lizard, he fixed, with a mixture of quicksilver, wings composed of scales stripped from other lizards, which, as it walked, quivered with motion. And having given it eyes, horns, and beard, taming it and keeping it in a box, he made all his friends, to whom he showed it, fly for fear. The principle of combination was nothing short of a cliché in art literature of the era, most of which harked back to the prime topos of ideal imitation in the Renaissance, as it's been called, the immortal anecdote quoted ad nauseum in Renaissance writing of Zeuxis and the maids of Croton. Like the description of the shield painting, or the figwood painting, the anecdote of the flying lizard chimera from which Leonardo's friends flew in fear suggests that in a topsy-turvy version of the effect of Zeuxis's beauty, either Helen or Venus, the naturalism of hybrid monsters is measured by responses to them. So, lest I assume too much art historical knowledge, Zeuxis, the great painter of antiquity, was called on to paint either a Helen or a Venus, it's not entirely clear. In order to do so, he explained he needed to combine the most beautiful features of the 5 most beautiful maids of Croton, the town in which he lived. The painting doesn't survive, but the principle lasted. So in a topsy-turvy version of the effect of Zeuxis's beauty, the naturalism of hybrid monsters is measured by responses to them. The legend of the image that resulted from Zeuxis's combination of various features of several women is one of ideal form, whereas the real chimeras Leonardo composed represent another locus of meaning, the imagination. Albrecht Dürer referred to this kind of production as dream work, where he wrote, and it's a really implausibly difficult German passage, but essentially he writes, if somebody wants to make eine Traumwerk, a dream work, then he should combine allerlei Kreatur untereinander mischen. He should mix all different kinds of creatures with one another in order to produce a dream work, he calls it. Interest in forging credible composites of existing animal parts is manifest in a range of works produced around the turn of the 16th century. In addition to his Temptation of St. Anthony, Schongauer engraved a hieratic and imposing chimera, which you see here, which in turn occasioned several copies, each marked proudly with the monogram of the derivative artist. Schongauer's invention consists of a fantastic creature whose hind legs are those of a goat or donkey and whose front legs conclude in fierce talons, whose wings are exaggerated protrusions from the hairy neck of a furry animal, and whose head is its own microcosmic composite of beak, tongue, ears, horns, eyes, and fur of various beasts. Usually identified as a griffin, this creature contains a wider variety of constituent parts than the mythical creature said to consist of the body of a lion, the wings of a dragon, and the head of an eagle. It follows a slightly different recipe than the recipe for a griffin, I would say. Schongauer's beast, like Leonardo's, features and conjures delight in a staggering multiplicity of component parts. Israel von Mechanim, who also copied the Temptation of St. Anthony, copied the chimera in an engraving he marked prominently with a decorative form of his own monogram. A third copy, an etching of the same animal set in a landscape and bearing a plaque on which Schongauer's monogram returns, further attests to the interest taken in remastering this image. Whereas the fact that works by a groundbreaking printmaker, such as Schongauer, occasioned copies is unsurprising, the fact that the Chimera, a fictive hybrid of naturalistic parts, should, like the demons haunting Anthony, have inspired exact copies seems to me vastly compelling. Part 3, From Chimeras to the Leviathan. This is a woodcut from a 1503 encyclopedic text called the Margarita Philosophica, the Pearl of Philosophy, which was widely used in university teaching, a sort of compendium of knowledge, and it is a diagram of what came to be called the internal senses of the mind and their respective functions. I'll just point out briefly before returning to the text that the lines of sense perception, all but the sense of touch, lead to the sort of entry point of the faculties of mind, which are divided into 3 ventricles. The first one is labeled in the very forefront sensus communis, or common sense, fantasia and imaginativa, so both terms appear here. This little valve is labeled vermis, valve, worm, literally, but valve. And then we have the faculties of reason, judgment and estimation. And finally, the third ventricle contains memory. A dominant paradigm, which held from Plato through the 17th century, posited that the imagination operates very much the way that artists do, for better or for worse. Early modern considerations on and representations of chimeras directly evince the workings of the imagination and suggest their familiarity and significance. The imagination designated, quote, the single mediator between the incorporeal soul and the corporeal human body, was cultivated and examined in the early modern era by physicians, philosophers, theologians, and artists alike, and valued in new ways for its ability to recombine the data, the images, provided by sensory experience. The idea being that sense perception is actually filtered in the sensus communis and by way of the imagination into images which can then be processed by the rest of the mind. In the words of Francis Bacon, the imagination, quote, not being bound by any law and necessity of nature or matter, may join things which are never found together in nature and separate things which in nature are never found apart. Hence, dreams, monsters, or works of art. In the course of the early modern period, numerous artists took recourse to, engaged, and effectively transformed an extensive and venerable history of considerations on the imagination. And here I show you a sheet from Leonardo's notebooks that contains his rereading, essentially, of the diagram I just showed you. Not literally, but his reorientation of the ventricles of the mind. For Leonardo, the fantasia comes to play a very central role. Within the history of art, the reappraisal of the combinatory powers of the imagination effected what has been described as a shift from mimesis to fantasia, and from, quote, the image of the artist as imitatore, as imitator, towards an image as inventore, as inventor, close quote. Such works as I have cited by Schongauer and Leonardo and Michelangelo and others represent the workings of fantasia or imagination in ways that reflect long-standing, principally Aristotelian, conceptions of internal images of non-existent entities, and that posit new ways of thinking about the status of such images. For a very long time, the relationship between sight, the external sense of vision, and imagination, construed as an internal sense, conditioned relationships between seeing and believing. Early modern medico-philosophical and artistic theories of the workings of the imagination depended, often explicitly, on the classical heritage. For all of the variability and complexity of the Aristotelian conception of imagination, or the conception of the imagination that his followers put forth, as Aristotle is quite taciturn on the subject, but said a few very important things that were then carried on through the scholastic tradition. So this classical heritage held fast in a more or less consistent way over centuries, as did the Aristotelian conception of the imagination as unreliable or prone to falsity. The image-based nature of fantasia or imagination is fundamental to Aristotelian formulations. Recall Aristotle's hugely influential proclamation in De Anima that, quote, the soul never thinks without an image, which he calls a phantasm, phantasmata. Aquinas reiterated and amplified Aristotle's claims and also distinguished between two roles fantasia or imagination, those being the Greek and Latin, respectively, terms, could play. On the one hand, it serves as a kind of storehouse for forms received through the senses, which is to say that it is a receptacle for the images it produces out of sensory perception. On the other hand, imagination actively combines records of sensory perception and generates mental images of non-existent entities, dreams, for example, or chimeras. Sensory data, transferred into images the mind could process, moved through the ventricles of the mind towards storage in the memory. When memory was activated, or when one dreamed, these images were brought out of storage, as it were, and perceived again by the mind's eye. In general, imagination was counted as one of the internal senses, along with common sense, reason, cognition, judgment, and memory, fitted out to process data supplied to the mind by the external senses. Whether identified as imagination or fantasia, and sometimes, as in the Gregor-Reich diagram, both were present, what is represented is the faculty of mind responsible for producing the images on which the workings of the mind depend. Now, the workings of the imagination are variously represented over time, as are the moral dimensions of this faculty of mind and mode of perception. Book 3 of Aristotle's De Anima explores broadly the relationship vis-a-vis the human soul of senses and knowledge, perception and thought. It opens with a passage that suggests that the faculty of the imagination is a tiebreaker of sorts, a referee in matters of truth and falsehood. Perception and thinking are clearly distinguished from one another by Aristotle, in contrast to ancients such as Empedocles, whom he cites, by way of the problem of error. So perception and thinking are distinguished by way of error. Whereas the two faculties or capacities of mind, perception and thought, had been construed as identical, Aristotle tests their respective abilities on the forge of error, proposing imagination as a third term that is capable of reconciling thinking and perceiving, even as imagination comes into its own as a faculty of mind. Imagination, Aristotle posits, and I quote, is different from either perceiving or discursive thinking, though it is not found without sensation or judgment without it, close quote. Much of the rest of Book 3 is devoted to assessing just what the imagination is and how it operates with regard to perception, belief, understanding, and thinking. In Aristotle's view, we may choose to engage imagination or not, in contradistinction to believing. We must either believe things to be true or false, whereas, he writes, quote, in the case of the imagination, we are just as if we saw the terrible or encouraging things in a picture. Close quote. The imagination is the domain of representation, and representation is not actual. It is virtual. Moreover, whereas perception cannot be false, we can be blind or numb, but what we perceive is not measured in units of truth or falsehood, imagination, according to Aristotle, is inclined to be untrue. While knowledge and intellect are always true and perception cannot be false, beliefs can be false or true, but, quote, imaginations are for the most part false. It is nonetheless, and all the more therefore, a worthy subject of philosophical deliberation. Imagination, on Aristotle's account, comes and goes, and is neither a potentiality like sight nor an activity like seeing. Imagination is, quote, thought to be a kind of movement, a movement taking place as a result of actual sense perception. Aristotelian precepts continued to inform conceptions of the workings of the mind and of the imagination well into the early modern period and animate a variety of media and genres. The views of the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes on the imagination are rarely cited in accounts of 17th century English political theory, and they are virtually absent from the art historical record, although it is worthy of mention that Hobbes wrote 3 treatises on optics, a subject that informed much of his natural philosophy. The second chapter of his greatest work, Leviathan, published in 1651, I show you here the title page, the very famous title page, of the Leviathan himself a sort of chimera, in fact, composed of constituent parts, although that's a different story. The second chapter of the Leviathan is devoted to the imagination, chapter 2, imagination, construed principally as an image-producing faculty of mind and prone to significant malfunction. For Hobbes, imagination is the processing mechanism that allows sense perception ultimately to be filtered to memory, and there he's in keeping with a very long tradition. Hobbes also speaks of simple and compounded imagination. The former involves perception of a thing once seen, and the latter the generation of fictitious, combined things, such as centaurs or chimeras. And this is just one quotation from Hobbes. I mean, I found it dramatically exciting to learn that the second chapter of the Leviathan is on the imagination, and a rather convoluted text, but in any case, he does go on at some length to define imagination and images. Hobbes's primary concern is the resistance imagination is capable of generating towards civil obedience and the integrity of the commonwealth. And precisely because his aim is to align man and his faculties with the workings of the state, Hobbes devotes considerable attention to the pernicious manipulations of the imagination, as well as to common misunderstandings of its function. These misunderstandings are acute in the distinction between dreams and perception. Giving credence to what is produced by a malfunctioning imagination is dangerous and potentially subversive. And I quote from Hobbes, "From this ignorance of how to distinguish dreams and other strong fancies from vision and sense did arise the greatest part of the religion of the Gentiles in time past that worshipped satyrs, fauns, nymphs, and the like, and nowadays the opinion that rude people have of fairies, ghosts, and goblins, and of the power of witches." So indeed, the whole power of witches is the problem of distinguishing dreams from reality. Control over the faculties hinges on control over imagination, and faulty attribution of agency amounts to a threat to social order in Leviathan. The handmaiden of sense perception, imagination has the power to lead the faculties, and with them the political subject, astray. It is also the case, in Hobbes's view, that the imagination accommodated the most deceptive phantasms of all, demonic illusions. Part 4. Interior temptation. The imagination is the locus of false images whose verisimilitude is powerful and potentially dangerous. Universally required to enable the mind to process sensory data, its combinatory powers and ability to transform sensory data made the imagination a fraught and crucial faculty of mind. One of the more dire instances in early modern thought and discourse of the transformation of sensory perception by imaginative powers was demonology. The effects of the devil, as rendered by early modern artists, compellingly instantiate the workings of the imagination. They are but images, that is, the effects of the devil, or the effects that are described as witchcraft, the actions that are attributed to witches, are but images, inherently false and strikingly verisimilar. Indeed, such pictures as I'm showing you here, this is by the Dutch artist Jacques de Geyn, extraordinary pen, ink, and wash drawing that dates to the first decade of the 17th century, a sort of malevolent inversion of anatomical practices, you might say, being performed by a small coven of witches in a dank basement. And here, from a century earlier, an extraordinary chiaroscuro woodcut by Hans Baldung Green, the German artist. Such pictures, artistic renderings of figures of the imagination, offer a commentary on the nature of images, both internal and external. Discussion of mental images permeates demonological literature of the early modern period to a rather alarming extent. The imagination is all over the demonological literature. And why, in a word or two? Because witches are subject to malfunctioning imagination, which is to say they are subject to the imposition of the devil, by the devil, of images on their susceptible minds. If those witches believe those things to be true and believe themselves to have enacted the images that the devil has imposed on their susceptible imaginations, then they are indeed witches, let's say. So there's a very elaborate discussion of the imagination in the demonological literature. The profoundly influential late 15th century Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, the inquisitorial manual on the prosecution of witches, the identification and prosecution of witches, explains, for example, that, and I quote, "The apparitions that come in dreams to sleepers proceed from the ideas retained in the repository of the mind through a natural local motion caused by a flow of blood to the first and inmost seal of their faculties of perception." Close quote. This is a universal physiological operation, dreaming and the production of dreams by way of the recurrence of these images. But it is also possible, according to many authors, that this motion was caused by devils, even in people who are awake. Quote, "For in these faculties," this is still from the Malleus Maleficarum, "also the devils can stir up and excite the inner perceptions and humors, so that ideas retained in the repositories of their minds are drawn out and made apparent to the faculties of fancy and imagination, so that such men imagine these things to be true," should in fact read such women, but it does read such men. "And this is called interior temptation." Close quote. In other words, the devil and demons beset and rework the operations of the imagination, and their effects are mental apparitions, images. And indeed, ideas about how the devil impressed illusions on, or by his artifice created images in the mind, are entirely congruent with artistic meditations on cultivating that very realm of the fantastic, which is, in my view, why artists took such an interest in representing witchcraft. Because they took an interest in it as a mode of exercising the imagination. But that's maybe another story. The nexus of demonic illusion and visual art has been the subject of a number of recent compelling studies by historians and art historians. And, let me just identify this. This is an engraving by the Dutch artist Jacques de Geijn, and this is usually dated about 1610, extraordinary, rather large format engraving of what is usually identified as a preparation for the Sabbath, a sort of amazing accumulation of various sorcerous activities in a rather dramatic landscape. The nexus of demonic illusion and visual art has been the subject of a number of recent compelling studies by historians and art historians. Stuart Clark's Vanities of the Eye, a magisterial study of early modern European conceptions of vision and perception, adduces the myriad ways in which discourses on demonology and witchcraft evince and affect conceptions of vision. Early modern conceptions of seeing and believing are fraught with demonological effects and other such illusions. Michael Cole has brilliantly explored the close ties between the literatures of magic and the demonic on the one hand, and the cultivation of painting as an art on the other. He writes, quote, "The idea of the demonic cuts across not only the early modern literature of magic and witchcraft, but also that of art, making possible a kind of refraction that illuminates both," close quote. Cole focuses primarily on the agents of illusion rather than the status of illusionistic images. Allowing that the literature of the period supports the notion that demonic illusions exist both as things and as the likenesses of things, Cole nonetheless is primarily interested in the painter as he, quote, "provides a function for the demonic imagination and the figure of the demon who provides the artist with a conception of medium," close quote. In a powerful study of the emergence of the figure of the witch in European art circa 1500 and the secularization or disenchantment of art, Christopher Wood, another art historian, identifies reverberating strains of thought about the power of illusion in magic and art alike. And he uses primarily as a sort of touchstone this extraordinary painting of Circe, usually identified as the painting of Circe, by the Italian painter Dossa Dossi, dated of 1515, 1516. Wood writes, quote, "Magic was only ever a way of describing the art of allure, indeed only ever a way of accounting for art in general, the various technologies of illusion and fictionalization," close quote. The case of demonic apparitions exacerbated concerns about illusionistic art and the power of fiction. Witchcraft or magic called into question the reliability of visual perception, just as mimetic art challenged the boundaries of the real, and the two combined powerfully. Art, Wood writes, ungrounded and in perpetual motion, suspends the question of the reality of the witch by provisionally occupying the same kind of space between that witchcraft had claimed for itself. Close quote. How then to avoid enchantment or deception, whether of the demonic or the artistic kind? In the case of apparitions, early modern beholders were encouraged to foster discernment, a specialized mode of judgment concerned to assess what in or of an apparition was real. False imaginations were believed in all too many cases to be real and to tragic ends. In Stuart Clark's view, the real tragedy of Macbeth lies in his miserable failure as a discerner of spirits. Taking the false to be real was also a threat in the domain of art, one broadly defined in the early modern era by the term counterfeit. And finally, counterfeit temptations. In a groundbreaking study of the early modern uses of the term counterfeit, or in Latin contrafactum, literally made against, Peter Parshall writes, and I quote, "Counterfeit had a special place in the Renaissance lexicon of terms having to do with identity and representation. Most striking is its insistent claim to truth, implicitly or explicitly a truth based on the testimony of direct observation. Although at first counterfeit was most often employed for portraits, it was quickly extended to include other subjects that for one reason or another seemed to ask for a special order of legitimacy." End quote. Is it surprising that Vasari refers to the process by which Michelangelo copies Schongauer's hybrid demons as counterfeit? I hope so. Otherwise, I'm here for nothing. Vasari's invocation of this recording mode is complex. While Michelangelo is said to have portrayed Schongauer's engraving in pen, he counterfeited the forms of the demons in color. And the passage that immediately follows Vasari's description of the painting of St. Anthony describes, again using the verb contraffare, how Michelangelo imitated various old master drawings and passed them off as originals. And I quote, "He also counterfeited sheets by the hands of various old masters, making them so similar that they could not be detected. For, tinting them and giving them the appearance of age with smoke and various other materials, he made them so dark that they looked old, and, when compared to the originals, one could not be distinguished from the other." Identity between new and old, copy and original, is very much at issue here, though in this passage the term counterfeit is used to describe the project of illegitimate, if masterful, copies. This amounts to a compelling inversion of the use of the term counterfeit and its insistent claim to truth, posited by Parshall. Vasari's account of the forged drawings opens with the verb contraffare itself, which resonates with the previous passage where Michelangelo's initial pen and ink copy of Schongauer's print is described as being indiscernible from the original, made di maniera che non era conosciuta, in a manner that was not recognizable. It could not be known, conosciuta. Just as Michelangelo went to the fish market to contraffare the demons in color, so too he also contraffece also these other sheets of drawings by various old masters. In his description of the sheets after old masters, Vasari emphasizes the fact that the real could not be distinguished from the fake. They were so similar that one could not know the difference. And he uses the verb conoscere several times here. Here, Vasari uses the forms of the verb conoscere several times in succession and in the negative. In other words, one could not know the difference, to attest to Michelangelo's ability to dupe viewers, echoing its occurrence in the description of the pen copy of the Schongauer print. These images were counterfeits, forged in such a way that the originals and their copies were equivalent. In the subsequent pages of the biography, which contain the famous account of Michelangelo's forgery of a carved marble faun for Lorenzo de' Medici, a sculpture that is lost, Vasari relies consistently on the verb contraffare to describe the artistic process. And there it's a fake after the antique. It's very clear. He also describes an early relief sculpture in which Michelangelo counterfeited the manner of Donatello, a work Leonardo himself donated to Lorenzo the Magnificent. If on the one hand to counterfeit is to imitate so effectively as to replicate an original to the point of evincing wonder, counterfeit works are, on the other hand, forgeries. They are in both cases convincing and in both cases deceptive. Likewise, it requires judgment or knowledge or discernment to distinguish between the original and a copy, or true and false. While Vasari does not seem troubled by the falsity of the counterfeit, his use of the term does raise the issue of the discernment or the distinction between forgery and original, or image and reality. In its early modern uses, the term counterfeit does not irrevocably signal truth, therefore, and those of you who know me know that I have a very difficult time disagreeing with Peter Parshall, but I'm doing it. Implied falsehood, so he believes that counterfeit and truth are fundamentally synonyms, right? Or let's say a truth claim. Implied falsehood is integral to conceptions of images to which counterfeit pertains. Indeed, where the term is adduced, counterfeit seems to refer to sense impressions made by external stimuli, and the word comes very close to signifying something on the order of phantasmata or images. Timothy Bright, author of a seminal treatise on melancholy published in 1586, wrote of those things which are sensible and are, as it were, the counterfeits of outward creatures, close quote. Bright's counterfeits are like the portraits or verifiable, trustworthy visual records that are commonly referred to as counterfeits, as per Parshall. It is a trope of early modern demonological literature that the devil is the consummate artist or imitator or illusionist. And here's a lovely image, late 16th century print by Martin van Heemskerk, a Flemish artist, of the devil as a painter. Unfortunately, for my purposes, he is not painting on the imagination, but it's an allegory. He's painting on the human heart. He's painting vanities on the human heart. Indeed, the devil was also deemed a master of counterfeits and counterfeiting, much as he is here portraying the vanities, let's say. The Swiss Reformation physician and theologian Thomas Erastus writes of the devil that he can, quote, deceive by means of counterfeits and substitute for things themselves semblances and empty illusions, close quote. The minor classicist Marek Casaubon wrote in the later 17th century that the devil can, quote, so imitate and counterfeit that we shall find it a very hard task to distinguish between the reality of that which he cannot and the resemblance which he doth offer unto our eyes, close quote. Erastus's invocation of the term builds on the common usage, where counterfeit or its vernacular counterparts refer to the image as a statement of fact, but it twists this conception, calling attention to the ability of an image to deceive. Elsewhere, Timothy Bright, too, writes of false or illusory images, calling them counterfeits. The melancholic, Bright explains, is particularly susceptible to perturbations that, quote, causeth not only fantastical apparitions, but fantasy forgeth disguised shapes, close quote. Of melancholy, he writes that it counterfeiteth terrible objects to the fantasy, and causeth it, without external occasion, to forge monstrous fictions, close quote. The melancholic, Bright writes, is tormented by those counterfeit goblins which the brain dispossessed of right discerning feigneth unto the heart. Chimeras such as Leonardo prescribed, drew, constructed with the aid of wax, or painted, or such as Schongauer forged and Michelangelo copied, challenged the reliability of vision and of naturalistic images in ways that, beyond inspiring fear of the real and awe at the skill in the viewer, also engaged judgment and discernment in signal ways. In some cases, the works may have been produced with the express intention of provoking an encounter with the contours of the real from which the illusion takes its form. Consider, in this regard, the conclusion of Vasari's account of Leonardo's fig wood painting, the early work in which he conjured from lizards great and small, crickets, serpents, butterflies, grasshoppers, bats, and other strange kinds of such-like animals, the painting he wished would have the effect of the Medusa. Vasari writes that when Leonardo had completed the work, he called his father to his room. Quote, Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, having knocked at the door, Leonardo opened to him, telling him to wait a little. And having gone back into the room, he adjusted the painting in a good light on the easel and put to the window in order to make a soft light, and then he bade him come in to see it. Ser Piero, at the first glance, taken by surprise, gave a sudden start, not thinking that that was the painting, not thinking that that was the piece of wood, nor merely the painted form that he saw upon it. And, falling back a step, Leonardo checked him, saying, This work serves the end for which it was made. Take it, then, and carry it away, since this is the effect that it was meant to produce. Close quote. Leonardo's first painting was a real chimera insofar as it recombined real forms to produce a hybrid so naturalistic that it evinced terror in the beholder. In Leonardo's view, it served its purpose by evincing or counterfeiting the effect of an actual monster, not merely painted. Incidentally, the immediately subsequent works described in Vasari's life tend to share the attribute of being hyper-naturalistic or more alive than life itself. In particular, Leonardo is said to have counterfeited a vase of flowers and to have painted the head of Medusa. It's an actual painting of the head of Medusa. The judgment elicited by counterfeit pictures hinges on whether we can trust our eyes. And in this sense, these images pose the same epistemological problems as the imagination. Where artists translated imaginative entities into physical images, or where they mimicked the recombinatory imaginative process by making real chimeras, for example, they plied the boundaries between the real and the imaginary, the illusory and the reliable. We may recall, as the early modern physician Julius Scaliger pointed out, that even great men take delight in illusion. The mind adores false things. Quote, Wise men loved Homer's inventions, he pointed out, and kings loved fools. The human mind, being infinite by nature, loves new things, especially those, like pictures of monsters, that surpass the common boundaries of truth. The wise man praises pictures, even though he hardly fails to realize that they are feigned. Close quote. As Scaliger goes on to suggest, the ability to create a convincing simulacrum, and thereby to fool a viewer, pertains to the quasi-divine capacity of the artist. Scaliger's text was printed half a century after the artists cited here produced their real chimeras. Most of the artists cited here it was printed in the early 17th century. And it does not explain why in the decades around 1500, the constellation of artists I have discussed, most of them, both north and south of the Alps, so productively cultivated the arena of imaginative production, and at the same time so purposefully plied the boundary between the true and the false. It has been argued that that was a moment, circa 1500, at which the powers of the imagination came to be newly esteemed and defined. Questions about the potential veridicality and reliability of vision persisted in a variety of discourses throughout the century. Alongside the new interest expressed in the imagination, the 16th century also witnessed the emergence of powerful forms of naturalism in representation, and both contributed to a new urgency on the part of the beholder's judgment. And this leaves out the whole question of images in the context of the Reformation. Where the imagination came to be seen as a motile, fertile, active locus of novelty and nightmare, it also gave rise to specters, and thusly to questions about whether to see was to believe. The value accorded images as counterfeits of the real, as simulacra of sense perception, had much the same effect. Saint Anthony, beset by hybrid demons whose torments he summoned the inner force to withstand, exemplifies the terrors of credible fictions. Likewise, images of Saint Anthony beset by hybrid demons figure the challenge of mimetic art and of apparitions simultaneously. In other words, don't believe what you see, or don't believe what you experience, or don't be upset by it, don't fall down. These real illusions are counterfeit chimera, naturalistic lies that figure the imagination and its processes and that can be tamed only by judgment. Is verisimilitude without truthfulness false? Perhaps it's in the eye of the beholder. Thank you.
At the risk of asking kind of insider question, I wonder if you could comment on the Dutch term case in relation to all of this, because it seems to have different aspects of imagination as you talked about it. And of course, it's very basic to the theory that you studied.
Would you like the 30-second answer, the 30-minute answer, or the 30-day answer to the question? So Professor Silver is referring to the use in Dutch art literature, and particularly in early 17th century biographical and theoretical writing, of the term geest, which is translated as spirit or imagination, usually. And this term occurs fairly consistently in the phrase uit den geest, from the imagination, and where it occurs in that sense often occurs in conjunction with another term, which is from the life. Now, much has been made of the pairing of these terms, so from the life being a kind of, you might say, dumb transcription of what one sees, and then from the imagination being a more fictive production. And I have, it's true, in my book I make quite a lot of the use of the term uit den geest, and I do believe it is consistent, let's say. Its use resonates with the way that I've talked about the early modern understandings of the imagination. But I actually don't think, in the end, that it is used that frequently in Dutch art literature. There was a moment at which Dutch art historians were striving. I actually thought about this moment during my talk. I thought, here I've been introduced as a historian of Dutch art. I'm living in the Netherlands, and for crying out loud, half the artists I'm talking about are Italian. What's wrong with this picture? In any case, there was a moment within our discipline in which Dutch art historians started to look for anything like the vast amount and the complex texts that were produced by Italian counterparts in the 16th and 17th centuries, and they came up relatively empty-handed. But in that context, a lot was made of the term uit den geest as a key theoretical term. I think actually that if one looks at practices and ideas about the imagination, starting, let's say, with the use of the term uit den geest, more broadly in the 17th century, there are really interesting things that have been overlooked. For example, in Carl van Mander's Lives of the Artists, which is sort of the Dutch Vasari, let's say, published in 1604, his Michelangelo, so as Michelangelo was to Vasari, Hendrik Goltzius is to Carl van Mander. And nobody talks about this, but van Mander is very clear about the fact that Goltzius was a melancholic, and that he suffered from what van Mander calls zwaarmoedigheid, which is sort of like a heavy humoral problem, basically, and that the cure was to go to Italy and look at good pictures. And he was indeed cured by you might say, the impression of these external stimuli on his imagination, the imagination was, of all people who suffered from dysfunctional imaginations, the melancholics were prime among them. So there are other instances of what you could say more distended or extended use of the term geest, or ideas about the functions of the mind or the imagination. I'm not sure that one could isolate them all in that term, though. I don't know if that answers the question.
So a suggestion, and sort of query. First, on that picture of the devil painting on the heart, that could actually be painting on the imagination or common sense, because in Aristotle's own theory, the heart was the seat of the senses, and so of the common sense, and so of the imagination. Those images that you showed from the Margarita or from Leonardo are based on a Galeno-Arabic anatomy, which says that the infections are located in the brain. And Aristotle famously thought of the brain as a kind of radiator that keeps the body cool. But going back to the notion of the imagination in this period, you probably come across the various schemes of the internal faculties, in which there are from 1 to 7, depending on the author, and there are many imaginations in some of these schemes, fantasia, and then maybe 2 different of these kinds of imagination. So the idea that the imagination was deceptive or not, you might want to pull back a little. And then the question of deceptiveness. So again, you can't generalize for all theorists, but for many theorists, the images in the imagination would be deceptive, but not literally false, because they only become false once they've taken the judgment. The judgment, and that's what makes it false. Then there's the other dialectic of the idea of the imagination as malfunctioning, which also suggests that there's a proper function in which it is sort of accurate and so forth. So I wonder if you want to help tease apart some of these schemes.
Yes, but first I want a pen, because I'm at pen, and I need one. Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is... let me see if I can tease something apart here. The question... okay, so first of all, thank you for the suggestion about the heart as opposed to the mind. And indeed, there are multiple models, it is true. I mean, I showed the Reich, and then the Gregor Reich, and then from the Margarita Philosophica, and then I showed the Leonardo drawing, and those two are just 2 examples of divergent models, but based on the same idea that there are these ventricles and that there is some relationship between them. And in general, even though there may be multiple functions of the imagination, certainly it is, I think, image-based. I don't think that there's much variation on that. So that the Aristotelian precept that the soul or the mind requires images to do its work holds fast in either of the traditions, the commentary traditions. Now, the question of the deceptiveness, and maybe, this is it's very useful to me to know that this should be made more clear, let's say, that it wasn't clear enough that indeed, whereas, I think for me the ultimate problem here is, whereas we all have these, or let's say, assuming we're all early modern individuals, whereas the functions of our mind depend on images, whereas when we dream, we, in some form, recall these images, and they are then recomposed, etc. Whereas we are all, in other words, subject to the functions of the imagination may produce composite images that could be deceptive. And then, indeed, it's my point, I guess, and I want to, or what I'm realizing must be made more clear, is that I don't mean to imply that they are sometimes totally deceptive and sometimes totally real, but that there is a problem, an ongoing problem of how you distinguish between one that is real and one that is deceptive. And it's a problem that resonates with the actual judicial history of witchcraft at the period. In other words, in the demonological literature, everybody is susceptible to recomposed imaginary, images, right? These fictive images. You're only a witch if you believe them to be true. So there's the great story about a woman who presents herself to a set of actual skeptical doctors and says, you don't believe that I'm a witch, or that this actually is true. One of the great defenses was that these women who were accused of witchcraft were merely melancholics. They were just subject to dysfunctional imaginations, right? And so there's a woman who says, you don't believe it's true, but I'm telling you, I do that stuff. And so they say, well, let's see it. Okay. So she smears it, she's put into a room, a kind of observation room, and she smears herself in with some kind of ointment that she's made, probably hallucinogenic in some way, herbs, etc. Falls into a completely profound slumber, does not move for 8 hours, wakes up and says, see? So the doctor said, oh, sorry, but you were asleep the whole time. In other words, that these things will occur regardless of whether we believe them to be true or not. And then the problem is whether you do believe them to be true. So if you believe that you have flown and that you've cavorted with the devil and etc., then you are subject to accusations of witchcraft. If you're able to dispel these images as the mere figments of your imagination, then you're okay. And this in turn resonates with the Reformation conception, or at least Luther's conception, that images in and of themselves are not a problem, but it's what you do with them. It's if you over-honor them, let's say. So I think that it's a great, it's very important for me to know that this should be made more clear, that it's, just as Luther said, it's the images are everywhere, and then it's a question of what one does with them. And so the faculty of discernment or judgment is indeed key. Sorry, long-winded answer to an important question.
Hi, I have two questions.
Yeah.
One just to follow up on Mary, actually, is a question, another insider question about invenzione and how you think that fits into this whole discourse, how it's different from fantasia. And then my other question is a bit huge, and maybe not one answer.
Because that one isn't.
But I wonder if you could speculate more about why it fits into is it pre-production? What sort of factors do you think are really producing this? Or is it because the SARS says it's happening and then they're looking back?
Well, thank you, Leah, for asking the question about invenzione, because that allows me, it not only follows up on Larry, but allows me to come back to the question of what is a functional imagination. So Leonardo, for example, says at a certain point, he says he is Signore Dio of all that he creates, from beauties to monsters. So he is Lord and God of what he creates. And I think that a functional imagination is one that is, let's say, prescribed, that's kept within limits, that is whose workings are understood and indeed controlled. So an artist who is able to convey the effects of the imagination to paper, to panel, whatever it is a practitioner of a functional imagination. That would be one example. Or indeed a devout individual who is able to deploy the imagination and the ability to recombine internal images in the practice of devotion might be, let's say, a practitioner of a functional imagination. How does this relate to invenzione, the artistic principle of invention? I am not an Italian art historian, so I'm not conversant enough with the theories of invenzione to make a declaration, but my sense is that this is bound up with the notion of invenzione. This is one form of invenzione. So I don't, in fact, know enough about invenzione through the 16th and 17th centuries to know, but I mean, I think you can invent a variety of different kinds of things. You could invent a composition, or you can invent a figure, or I don't know, but I think that there must be points of convergence here where the, let's say, conditioning, manipulation, and then kind of a form of control of the imagination would be a form of invenzione. 1500. I don't know. I don't have. That's your job. I'm just saying it's all happening around then. I don't know. I mean, in the case of an artist whom I didn't discuss, Hieronymus Bosch, he was implicit here, but I didn't discuss him. It has been asserted that there is a new appreciation within the context of courtly patronage, within the context, you might say, of the liberation of the artist from the, as a liberal artist, of the performance of the imagination, of the ability to create new and unknown things. Yeah, still, why? I mean, I suppose that the shift to the liberal arts has a lot to do with it, but I don't know exactly.
If I'm an artist at the time and feel that the devil, in fact, can enter and influence my imagination, does the corollary rule that then God can also come in and influence this as I paint angels and archangels And how do you distinguish who's coming in?
Yes. Let's say the demonological theories of the effect of the devil or the access that the devil has to one's imagination are a kind of flipped version of devout theories of, or not devout theories, but practices of devotion. And this is something that, again, Michael Cole has written about, is, how do you tell whether you've had a vision of an angel, for example, but the mechanics are very similar. This is an engraving by Albrecht Dürer often called The Temptation or the Dream of the Doctor, in which a clearly identifiable demon, it's not an angel, let's say, is using bellows to blow into the sleeping man's ear. And in fact, the mechanics are often described as the devil blows, he inspires, right? But so does God, actually. God inspires as well. So, there is a lot of overlap or convergence there. It is indeed the flip side. And then the problem is how you guard yourself against it, or what how you defend yourself against it. How you... Sorry, I think I've missed the end.
Easy answer of distinguishing who's blowing in your ear?
Well, by virtue of what it is that gets blown into your ear, right? So if you have, horrific visions of, witches' sabbaths, or of, performing activities that are ungodly, you might assume that it was the devil who got in there, as opposed to visions that were of a different sort. I think so. The effect would determine the cause, would identify the cause. Although there are great cases of the devil impersonating good individuals, right? So here again, it's a question of discernment. That you have to be able to judge, but how it's ultimately I can't remember. There's one of the devil as a cleric story, but discernment would be the key thing, judgment, to be able to determine whether this is let's say a real or a good vision, or a false or bad one.
Is there an assumption, Claudia, running through all this that you didn't specifically speak to this, but it seems to me suggesting the kind of gendering of this, power of discernment and the ability to distinguish between good and bad. Imagine these diabolical and godly ones that somehow the artists are all men and the witches are all women. Is that how it works? Does that appear more explicitly in any way?
Basically, that's how it works. The gender question is, on the one hand, very complicated, on the other hand, pretty simple. It seems to me that, in general, the individuals who are subject to deformations of the imagination, to malfunctioning imagination, are women. And that individuals, up to and including the artist, of course, who are able to control, who have dominion over their own imaginations, are men. The imagination itself, it's been argued, is a feminine, domain, but it doesn't seem to me that the imagination per se is gendered in the text that I'm dealing with. But in terms of who is able to control it and who isn't, it doesn't look good for us. Yeah.
A question about the term counterfeit.
Oh, yeah.
At one point, at the end of the talk, you said Michelangelo was able to counterfeit an effect, which seemed to be a different use than you've been using before, where you're counterfeiting an object, you're counterfeiting an engraving. And so that got me thinking, recalls me, the whole line of argument is compelling. What's in question is not imitation, but rather effect. And what they're aiming for is, by any means, to produce the same effect. It's not so much the image, but the effect the same. And then, correct me if I've got a false memory that's been identified in some people. The Vasari question also wrote a great deal about rhetoric and is brought back the rhetorical tradition in responsibility. And if not, at the very least, someone is bringing back rhetoric. So I'm wondering if there's some connection to a new emphasis on rhetoric as opposed to grammar or dialectic, where the aim is where the efficacy of a text, written text, is judged not by its truth in some another species of eternity, but rather how will it persuade. And that persuasion is done precisely by appeal to the senses, right? Vivid imagery, striking scenes, with bright colors, exactly as you displayed here. So, is there some correlation between the shift in the conception of the artist and the conception of the image to a shift that's occurring in the conception of language and the author as well, where there's a return against Plato in favor of Gorgias, in favor of the sophists, to an emphasis on persuasion over and against truth. And so, I mean, that brings up the question of discernment again, because rhetoric is not particularly concerned with discernment. It wants to override discernment, or it's happy to manipulate and confuse the discernment, as long as the effect wins out, so that the people who are hearing do what the speaker wants them to.
This is what I really miss about John Tresh. Great question, great answer. Yes. Okay, so first of all, you're absolutely right that the key thing here is effect. So you started by referring to the passage in Vasari where he talks about Michelangelo counterfeiting not, let's say, the objects, the chimeras, but the manner of other artists. I think that was what you're referring to. But in any case, the key thing here is effect, and that could maybe be made clearer by repeating the passage about Leonardo, the concluding passage about Leonardo's painting, where he's, maybe if I read them together, it would be even clearer. So he makes this horrific, monstrous thing, blah, 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 etc. Basically, the longer story is that a peasant comes to the father and says, I've got this piece of fig wood in the shape of una rotella, kind of like a shield, actually. And he says, will you do something with it? And so Leonardo's father gives it to Leonardo, and Leonardo says it's misformed, etc. And instead of painting some, emblem on it, just giving it back to the peasant, he, does this incredible thing. Transforming it so it no longer can serve the purpose of just giving it back to the peasant, whom the father wishes to honor because he's useful. I can't remember, he cuts down trees or he does something useful. So the father is actually interested in returning something to the peasant. But Leonardo transforms this piece of wood into something very different. This monstrous, horrible thing that he creates. And what's incredible is that he wants to create something that is like the head of Medusa, a painting of the Medusa, or like the head of Medusa. In fact, it's all about effect. It's all about effect. And when his father sees it, the minute his father is terrified, he says, I'm done. It's over. Take it away. And the father does. And what he does is he sells it in Florence. And then he finds something else to give to this peasant. But in any case, from Leonardo's perspective, it is all about effect. And it seems to me that is key in a number of the instances that I adduced. So now the question of the whole rhetorical question, I don't know. It's not Vasari, to the best of my knowledge, who is deeply engaged. I mean, he's engaged in the language debate. That is true, but I don't think as a rhetorician. Although that's certainly an important discussion. I'm not the one to ask. Maybe Leah can jump in on this. But in any case, I do think that this is actually very important. That this distinction between let's say, the real and the false, or you could say virtuality, is a question of persuasion and likewise of effect, or of effect and persuasion, and discernment. That the only way to counter it, if you can, is by way of discernment. So I think that is also a way of explaining. I mean, on the one hand, maybe it's not so awkward that all of these printmakers made these copies of the Schongauer prints, but on the other hand, they're making these exact copies and then signing them themselves. Well, okay, print distribution is not really that wide at the time, so maybe they could fool, a smaller audience than, let's say, but why are they making these copies? I mean, there is something about that that's sort of weird and interesting, and possibly about the ability to reproduce some kind of effect. It's not so much about the object, but about the effect. And certainly, on the one hand, of course, Michelangelo wanted to know what colors these demons should be, but I think, he goes to the fish market to make them hyper-naturalistic, and also to if they are to be convincing composite creatures, then you've got to go back to the individual components. You can't just cut. And indeed, effect seems important there too. So, yes.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. This is not a comment, so the question just really struck me in part of this conversation is going in a couple of different directions of with demons and without demons. That part of what's going on with the folks you're talking about is efforts to combine on their part a couple of different scholarly and discursive traditions that do function independently in other settings. That is, you can have all these theories about the imagination. I mean, they all develop out of theory of demons. And it's perfectly possible as a physician in the 16th century to have a well-developed theory about human psychology, perception, and imagination, and so on, without believing in demons at all, or having an opinion on the subject that you ever care to express or develop or anything else. So, too, you can have theories of demons without much of a theory of medicine or panacea, except insofar as Galenic theory, in a rough and ready sort of way, is kind of part of the everyday language people use to talk about medicine, the way we would talk about germs in some kind of undistinguished way when we talk about getting sick. And so what's especially interesting with some of these characters that you point out is what they do when they're trying to combine those two different traditions and work them out together, because they don't always fit together very well. And as I say, they don't fit together for all 16th century people either. And so I don't want to develop that a bit. Who cares about the fantasy with demons and who without? But it's the ones that are doing it with that are particularly compelling here in talk.
Yes. Okay, so it is true that there is imagination without demons, and there are demons without imagination, but it's also true that there are these sort of marvelous points of conjunction. So Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, which is this, atlas of the melancholic condition, at a certain point when he talks about the melancholic imagination, which he does at some length, and he talks about the deformations of the melancholic imagination, and melancholics are susceptible to all kinds of, dreams and fantasies, things that are not real, etc. He stops and he says, for more on this subject, see Jan Veer, who is the author of this incredible book on the tricks of the devil, a book that Freud counted as one of the 10 best books of all time, which is really a study of sort of, of psychology, in effect. But in any case, okay, he was a skeptic on the subject of witchcraft and explained witchcraft, by and large. Jan Veer explained witchcraft as simply a misunderstanding about deluded imaginations, and there is a substantial line of demonological literature like that. So, but it's interesting that Burton would then say, for more on this subject, see. So, I mean, there seems to me to be a convergence among these things. This was borne out for me. I mean, this is not to defend the point, but simply to say that I could not, for a very long time, although I wrote my dissertation on Jacques de Rennes, who is known for his natural historical works and also for his images of witchcraft. And the whole time I was working on my dissertation, I could not read about witchcraft. I mean, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't deal with it. Couldn't manage. It was a no-go. And then this fantastically brilliant book, incredible book by Stuart Clark came out called Thinking with Demons, which is about responses to witchcraft in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I read this book. It's a fantastic book. I had the occasion to meet Stuart Clark. And, so what happened was I read the book and I suddenly thought, okay, I can read this stuff, because his view of it was simply as, let's say, a discursive response to the problem of witchcraft, not so much the judicial, social history. And I went back to the witchcraft literature and started to read these 16th and 17th century sort of horrifying texts, and I found that the terms, according to of all, imagination is all over. There is actually very little demonological theory without the imagination. I mean, there is some, but it's pretty much all over. And this is just a little tangent. primarily because there are some effects of witchcraft that cannot be explained otherwise. And this goes back to the canon episcopi. I mean, this is, late medieval stuff on how do you explain nocturnal transvection? Everybody knows nobody flies at night on a broomstick. I mean, this cannot be explained by the laws of... There is no way to explain this. And that is explained even in the most stringent of inquisitorial texts as an effect of the imagination, because that only occurs within. And then, okay, so I started to read the text, and I was struck by the fact that imagination is all over, and doubly struck by the fact that the terms according to which the imagination is discussed are exactly the terms that occur in art theory at the time. So then I had occasion to meet Stuart Clark, and I said, is this cracked? I mean, I don't know, but this is just my impression that, I mean, he's, of all the, scholars I can think of, he's the one who's read most of the stuff. I said that the imagination is all over, and these terms are so consistent. And he said, well, the only answer I can give you is that my next book is on optical and visual effects. In other words, it is very deeply ingrained, but it's important, I think you're right, to allow for the possibility that they are not always totally intertwined. Otherwise, what am I going to write about? There has to be some exception or something.
I think we've kept Professor Swan.
Oh, I'm just getting started here.
Maybe